Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Guild Wars 2 End of Dragons is leading into a new era of endgame content for Guild Wars 2, this being strike missions. Now I'm quite excited about strike missions. They initially came with Icebrood Saga and we got a little taste of them. In End of Dragons they're said to be a little bit more complex, and from what the developers have been saying about them, they seem to have a nice handle on things. Hopefully when we get to play it, that comes true. But in the meantime, I was thinking about the other expansions and core game. What could strike missions look like for the other areas that were created long ago? So this little video is going to be a little bit more fun-based. I'm not saying anything necessarily serious, but I'm also not saying anything not serious. So strike missions, I think strike missions are a positive direction for Guild Wars 2 to go in. It requires a lot less generating of new assets, creating whole different storylines for actual raid wings, and it allows them to reutilize story bosses that they are already programming and developing. But when you look back at the core game, Heart of Thorns and Path of Fire, you realize that strike missions are not there. And what would it be like if they were, in fact, implemented? Now, I'm not saying that they're going to go back and retroactively add strike missions. However, I would say that it's not such a bad idea to use as a little bit of padding if there ever are some droughts in game development for future seasons or expansions. So for strike missions, they have a currency system. So far, Icebrood Saga is going to be getting blue gems, and End of Dragons is going to be getting green gems. For core strike missions, I think red gems would be a perfect slot in. Red gems currently do exist, but with the expansion, red gems are being retired for the moment. And for Heart of Thorns, I would suggest probably green gems, Path of Fire probably blue. A currency is such a minor thing, but what about the actual bosses? I have listed 3 to 4 bosses per core game and per expansion to make it a feel of what I would recommend implementing as actual bosses that seem to have a nice space in Guild Wars 2 already and probably wouldn't need to have a whole lot of balancing or incredibly drastic reworks and redesigns to be implemented into strike missions. First and foremost, let's talk about the core game. I think for the core game of Guild Wars 2, 3 encounters come to mind. Now, the very first encounter actually would be maybe a 2-boss system. Granted, you could split these up into multiple, but I took inspiration from the Conan strike mission in Icebrood Saga. The first strike could be the Sovereign Mouth of Zaitan and the Sovereign Eye of Zaitan in the Artesian Waters. At the very end of the personal story, you fight the Sovereign Eye of Zaitan at the Artesian Waters, and when the game released, it was a fairly interesting boss fight, but with power creep, it's kind of become much more mundane and easily conquered. I thought to maybe give it a little bit extra of a boost, you have both the eye and the mouth that you're fighting. Of course, with the core game, you probably have to increase the amount of health by probably like 25–50%, add 1 or 2 more mechanics to interact with break bars, or something along those lines. As for the Mouth of Zaitan, I would say just pluck the Mouth of Zaitan boss fight in the dungeon and implement it into the strike mission boss. I think it has an interesting mechanic of needing to throw a fireball into its mouth to interrupt it. That adds a little bit of movement and it adds a little bit more flair to the combat. For the second boss fight, I would highly recommend Giganticus Lubicus. Honestly, Giganticus Lubicus could be implemented as a strike mission right now, and I think it would fare pretty well. Only thing I would say, probably increase the health once again by 20%, 25%. Maybe you would have to go back, edit some of the ways you can cheese the mechanics by glitching it into a wall, using reflex to just instantly melt it down within 1 second. Slight things like that, but overall, I think Giganticus Lubicus, I would be really surprised to never see it be a strike mission. Unless they never go back. But if they ever do, Giganticus Lubicus is actually like #1 on my list. Next is Zaitan. Zaitan's current boss fight is absolutely anticlimactic and really bad, but I think strike missions, this is the only one on this list. Zaitan is very much deserving of a revamp, and I think if they were ever to go back and implement older bosses into a strike mission system, I think Zaitan would be a great opportunity to then go back and revise and say, hey, this staple asset piece, this staple boss in the core game, we're actually going to give it a proper boss fight. Moving on to Heart of Thorns. Heart of Thorns, I think, actually has quite a few amazing bosses. Overall, was really well tailored to a more harder aspect of Guild Wars 2. It was certainly a challenge increase when you compare it to core Guild Wars 2. But as for strike missions, I think there are 3 standouts. First and foremost, I would have, similar to the Coden one of multiple bosses, I would have the first strike mission be 10 players fighting the 3 Mordrum commanders, Stave Master Adrian, Blade Master Diarmid, and Axe Master Harith. You could argue that they each are deserving of their own strike mission. However, they're just such a nice, strong unit in Mordremoth's army that seeing a strike mission when you're in that arena fighting 3 bosses at once, fighting 3 of Mordremoth's strongest commanders, I think that would be pretty iconic. So I would actually love to see them be a strike mission. Next would probably be Vinetooth Vowlin. Now, Vowlin, you might argue, isn't the most interesting boss fight. However, if you recall, just before you go into Hearts and Minds and fight Mordremoth, you actually fight Vinetooth Vowlin, where there's a whole lot of knockbacks. She summons dangerous AoE effects and poison effects. I think she has potential to be a strike mission boss. Also, there's a whole ledge. Maybe she could knock you off, and that's how you could also perish in the fight. But I think Vowlin would need maybe some health increase, 1 or 2 more mechanics, maybe summoning some extra Mordrum adds, or immobilizing enemies in blighting pods, which then creates a doppelganger of themselves that they have to fight because it's like a champion and it does a lot of damage. So on and so forth. But I think Vinetooth Vowlin as a boss model could be an interesting strike mission. And then finally for Heart of Thorns, my final recommendation, I mean, this was hopefully obvious. This would be Migraine Mode Mordremoth. Now, Migraine Mode was already a challenge mode for a story mission, which was fairly bold at the time. There had never really been a challenge mode setting for a story mission boss, but they decided to do it with Mordremoth, and I actually really loved it, despite the numerous bugs that it launched with. Now, that time has passed, many of the bugs have been corrected. There still might be some outstanding bugs that would need to be touched up, but I think if we got 10 players into that Mordremoth mind and you fight the Migraine Mode of Mordremoth, that would be really interesting. However, for this fight, there would need to be alterations where the ads do not pop up. The ad NPCs to help you wouldn't show up to make the fight easier over time. You wouldn't have it to where Mordremoth stops using certain abilities. And I think overall, you'd probably have to just increase the health because 10 players, more damage overall. That being said, Mordremoth, great fight. Next, let's move on to Path of Fire. Now, Path of Fire had a lot of bounties, and I felt like that was the direction developers were going down for endgame content to keep players playing the game. However, the bounties felt somewhat repetitive, and only the legendary bounties really were outstanding boss encounters. Now, there are 4 bosses that I've been thinking about for Path of Fire. First and foremost, Archon Iberu. Archon Iberu we meet fairly early on in the story. However, I would probably recommend his boss fight be towards the Desolation when we get closer and actually fight him before we go and become an illusion of Archon Iberu to manipulate the Awakened in Joko's palace. Archon Iberu could be a very big potential strike mission boss. Second, let's talk about the Herald of Balthazar. Herald of Balthazar would probably show up a little bit earlier than Archon Iberu's boss fight, but I wanted to keep all of the Forge together. So Herald of Balthazar is a really great fight. Granted, not super difficult, but I think if you were to put her in a strike mission scenario, increasing her health, letting her use all of her abilities, like the heat shield, giving her some barrier, maybe allowing her to summon and call in reinforcements for some forged war mages and some forged hounds, play around with the ads and some different pylon structures that they create. But overall, I think the Herald of Balthazar, a really cool model, a very statement piece in the expansion, has an interesting boss fight along the expansion, and I think if you just expanded upon that, she could have been a really interesting strike mission. Third, this is kind of the connection to the very final boss fight, or the very final strike mission boss recommendation that I have, which many of you have probably guessed already. But this third slot would be the War Beast that Balthazar created. I think the War Beast is kind of a forgotten boss fight. It's very picturesque and very cinematic, but I don't think the players spent enough time with the War Beast to really understand what it was all about. Nevertheless, the actual mechanics about the War Beast, I see fitting very well in a strike mission. The one thing I would say is that the arena would probably need to be changed, because the arena that the War Beast is in is actually my recommendation for the final strike mission of Path of Fire. Speaking of which, let's talk about my final recommendation strike mission for Path of Fire. This being, no one could have seen this coming, Balthazar. I think Balthazar is a really awesome character, really iconic. I mean, what better to have as a strike mission as a quote-unquote raid boss in a single arena than fighting a god? Balthazar has a lot of interesting mechanics, summons ads, has interesting telegraphs and AoE effects. I think the mission in the personal story is easier when you have Zaitan, but if you don't take Zaitan, I feel like Balthazar is actually a fairly decent fight when you're playing it solo. Of course, in a 10-player environment, as all of these, increase the health, allow him to use some boons. I think across the board, all strike missions, more bosses, more raid bosses need to actually utilize boons consistently. So more boons, more health, more barrier, a little bit more damage, 1 or 2 more mechanics, and add a couple adds here and there. But that, everyone, is my list for what the strike missions could have been if strike missions were to be retroactively added, or if they were to be a thing since the launch of Guild Wars 2, from the vanilla game to Heart of Thorns to Path of Fire. Going into End of Dragons, I'm very much excited to play the strike missions and to see how they actually feel normal, and then of course to see how they compare to their challenge mode variants. I also hope to see some more rewards for maybe mounts or skiffs or fishing poles, you never know. But overall, I am very much excited for the future of strike missions and endgame PvE. Hopefully this is a route they can go down to keep consistency. Thank you everyone so much for coming by. Like the video if you liked it, comment below your thoughts about any other bosses that you might want to see be strike missions, or comment about the bosses that I have mentioned here. If you'd like to help support the channel and get videos early, you can head over to the Patreon. If you'd like to help support the channel other ways, you can pre-order End of Dragons using my links. Thank you so much, ArenaNet. And I'll catch you all in the next video. Bye everyone! Mwah!